Halloween night had always been Samantha's favorite. This year, though, she wanted to do something more thrilling. She and her friends decided to visit the old bridge, known locally as the Wailing Bridge. According to legend, a woman had tragically drowned near it decades ago, and ever since, locals have claimed to hear her cries in the dead of night. Samantha had heard these stories all her life, but she was skeptical, dismissing it as a local ghost story meant to spook children. As they approached the bridge, mist began to gather around their feet, thick and white, swirling with an almost hypnotic effect. The air felt colder here, Samantha thought, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. She glanced at her friends, who had fallen unusually silent. There was a chill in the air that seemed to seep into their bones, filling each of them with a sense of dread they couldn't shake. They made their way to the middle of the bridge, trying to keep the mood light by laughing and teasing each other. But as the minutes ticked by, the laughter faded, and a heavy silence settled over them. Then, faintly, from somewhere below, came the sound. It was so soft at first that Samantha thought she was imagining it, but the sound grew louder, a soft, mournful cry, like someone calling out in despair. Her friend pointed his flashlight over the edge, but the beam barely pierced the thick fog below. Samantha could feel her pulse quicken. "It's probably just an animal," she whispered, but her voice trembled. Then they saw her. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, standing just at the water's edge. She wore a tattered, soaking wet dress, her hair plastered to her face and shoulders. She looked up, her face pale and hollow, her eyes wide with an expression of sorrow and fear. In that instant, the woman's eyes snapped upward and locked onto Samantha's. The crying stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, Samantha felt paralyzed, unable to move or even breathe. She was frozen in place, caught in the intensity of the woman's empty gaze. Then, without warning, the woman began to move toward them, her feet barely touching the ground. She didn't walk. She glided, her movements swift and unnatural, closing the distance faster than any of them could react. Panic took hold, and Samantha turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. Her friends were already at the other side of the bridge, urging her to hurry. When she reached them, she risked a glance back. The figure had stopped at the edge of the bridge, her haunting gaze fixed on them. Samantha could still feel the weight of that gaze, as if it was embedded in her mind. To this day, she avoids that bridge, but sometimes, in the dead of night, she hears faint sobbing, echoing through her room. She wonders if the crying woman marked her that night, as though choosing her to carry her sorrow, or perhaps waiting for the day Samantha would return. Moving into her new apartment had been a dream come true for Emma. She'd spent years saving up, imagining what it would be like to finally have a place of her own. The building was old, with creaky floorboards, peeling wallpaper, and the kind of vintage charm she'd always loved. Her family had helped her move in, and they'd shared dinner on the living room floor, laughing and toasting her new start. It was all exactly how she'd imagined it, until the noises started. The first night, it was just the sound of the closet door creaking open. She was lying in bed, scrolling through her phone, when she heard the low, drawn-out creak. Emma looked up, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the closet was empty. She figured it was just a draft, or maybe the door was loose, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As the weeks passed, the noises grew louder, filling her room at night. Every evening she'd go to bed, hoping for silence, but each night the whispers would start. They were soft at first, almost like the sound of the wind moving through the walls, but there was something about them that made her uneasy. She could swear they sounded like voices, low and hushed, speaking words just out of reach. One night, she finally decided to investigate. She'd heard enough ghost stories to know that disturbing whatever might be lurking in a closet was usually a bad idea, but her curiosity was too strong. Emma grabbed a flashlight and slowly opened the closet door, shining the light into the shadows. Nothing. Just empty space and a few of her old jackets hanging limply on the rod. But as she turned to close the door, she noticed something at the back. A small leather-bound book, its cover worn and cracked with age. She pulled it out, feeling a strange chill as she held it in her hands. The diary seemed ancient, its pages yellowed and frayed. She flipped through it, realizing it was a journal written by a previous tenant. The entries were brief, almost frantic, detailing strange noises, shadows, and a sense of being watched. The writer had become more paranoid with each entry, mentioning dreams of figures lurking around the bed, whispering in the dark. The last entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting, as if written in a rush. "The voices are louder tonight. I can hear them right next to me. They want me to open the door." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. She closed the book, heart pounding, and put it back in the closet. She couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, by reading the diary, she had invited whatever was in the closet into her life. She tried to ignore the whispers after that, but they only grew louder. Now, they were distinct, almost taunting, calling her name in a raspy, guttural tone. She began to see things out of the corner of her eye, shadows that would flicker and vanish before she could turn her head. One night, as she lay in bed, the whispers grew so loud they seemed to fill the entire room. She could feel a presence pressing down on her, cold and suffocating. She tried to move, but her body was frozen, paralyzed with fear. The shadows seemed to creep closer, their voices a low, mocking chant, each whisper growing sharper, more sinister. Unable to bear it any longer, Emma fled the apartment the next morning, leaving everything behind. She didn't care about her deposit or her belongings. She just needed to escape. Even now, months later, she can still hear the whispers sometimes, faint but unmistakable, echoing in the corners of her mind. It's as if they've followed her, waiting for the moment she lets her guard down, ready to call her back to that dark, haunted closet. Zerbo had always prided himself on being a level-headed EMT. He'd seen his share of trauma and tragedy on the job, but nothing had ever really shaken him, until that night on Rig 12. Rig 12 was infamous among the crew. Every EMT in the area knew the stories about it, passed down over years of late-night shifts and whispered tales. They said it was haunted, that strange things happened on board, especially in the dead of night. Zerbo wasn't one for ghost stories, but he couldn't deny the strange feeling he had every time he worked in Rig 12. The air inside the ambulance felt different, colder, as though a draft seeped in from the walls. His colleagues would joke about the phantom patient, an invisible presence that supposedly rode along on calls, always just out of sight. It was a quiet night when it happened, a stretch of hours with no calls, which was rare. Zerbo had dozed off in the back of the rig, hoping to catch some sleep before the next emergency. But he was jolted awake by a faint sound, so soft he almost didn't hear it. It was a voice, distant and muffled, as if someone were speaking through layers of static. Am I dying? The question hung in the air, chilling him to the core. He sat up, looking around, but the back of the rig was empty. His partner was in the front seat, fast asleep, oblivious to the eerie stillness that filled the ambulance. Zerbo tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the voice came again, clearer this time. Please, am I dying? The tone was pleading, filled with desperation and fear. A shiver ran down his spine. He turned, his eyes scanning the empty stretcher, half expecting to see a figure lying there. But there was nothing. Just the cold, silent interior of the ambulance. He reached out, almost instinctively, to adjust the oxygen tank. But as he did, he felt a chill wrap around his hand, like an icy grip tightening around his fingers. Heart pounding, he looked down, half expecting to see a hand holding his. But his hand was empty, the skin numb from the cold. Just as he was about to pull away, the hiss of oxygen filled the air, loud and sudden, as though the tank had been turned on. But when he checked, the tank was off, the valve firmly in place. In that moment, Zerbo felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over him, as though he could feel the emotions of whoever, or whatever, was there. It was a feeling of loss, of longing, as though the spirit was reaching out, desperately seeking help. He backed away slowly, his heart racing, and slid open the partition, hoping his partner would wake up and confirm he wasn't losing his mind. But as he turned back to close the door, he saw something in the corner of his eye, a faint outline on the stretcher, as though someone were lying there, barely visible, like a shadow or a wisp of smoke. The figure seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a face, pale and hollow, with eyes that seemed to stare right through him. The vision lasted only a second before it vanished, leaving him alone in the silent rig. The next day, Zerbo requested to switch to a different ambulance, and though he tried to put the experience behind him, he could never quite shake the feeling that he'd encountered something beyond explanation. To this day, he avoids Rig 12, but he still wonders about the phantom patient, the voice that haunts him, and whether it was a lost soul reaching out, trapped between worlds, forever searching for a final moment of peace. After moving into a new house, Jim and his wife Sarah were thrilled about the extra space and the large basement, which they planned to turn into a den. The basement was dark and a little damp, with low ceilings and brick walls that gave it an old, eerie charm. But Sarah had always felt something was off about it. She brushed it off, telling herself it was just the natural chill of a basement, but the strange feeling lingered, gnawing at her in quiet moments. One evening, Jim decided to stay late downstairs, setting up the space while Sarah headed to bed. Around midnight, she was jolted awake by the sound of heavy footsteps. She figured Jim was just moving things around, so she turned over and tried to go back to sleep. But the footsteps grew louder and heavier, as though someone, or something, was pacing back and forth across the basement floor. She texted Jim, asking if everything was all right, but there was no response. She got up, her heartbeat quickening. and slowly descended the stairs. The basement light was on, casting long shadows across the walls. As she reached the bottom step, she froze. There, standing at the far end of the room, was a dark figure. It was a shadowy shape, with no distinct features, yet it seemed almost human. Tall, with broad shoulders and elongated arms that hung eerily at its sides. The figure didn't move, but Sarah felt a heavy, oppressive energy radiating from it, filling the room with an unnatural cold. She called out for Jim, her voice trembling, but he didn't answer. It was only then that she noticed her husband slumped against the wall, his face pale, his eyes wide open, staring blankly ahead. She rushed to his side, shaking him, trying to get him to respond, but he remained unresponsive, almost catatonic. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw the shadow move. It glided across the room, its form shifting and swirling like smoke. It stopped just a few feet away from her, and for a split second, she felt as though it were watching her, studying her, with a dark curiosity. She felt an intense, suffocating dread, as though her very soul was being pulled toward the shadow. Panicked, she dragged Jim up the stairs, his limp body heavy and unwieldy. As they reached the top step, she risked a glance back. The shadow was standing at the bottom of the stairs, its form twisting and stretching, as though it were trying to follow them. She slammed the basement door shut, locking it, her heart pounding in her chest. The next morning, Jim had no memory of what happened. He brushed off her story as a bad dream, but Sarah knew what she'd seen. She could still feel the chill of that shadow, lingering in the back of her mind. She made him promise never to go down to the basement alone again. And though they tried to avoid it, strange things continued to happen. Flickering lights, doors opening on their own, and a faint, echoing whisper that would drift up from the darkness below. Even now, Sarah wonders if the shadow is still waiting down there, lurking in the basement, waiting for the day she makes the mistake of going back down alone. Marie had been a night nurse at St. Andrew's Hospital for years, and she'd seen her share of strange things, but nothing as terrifying as what she experienced in room 413. Room 413 was at the far end of the hall, a quiet, isolated room that patients only stayed in if the hospital was at full capacity. There were stories among the nurses about the room, whispers of strange occurrences, but Marie never paid much attention to them. That is, until she met Mrs. Whitaker. Mrs. Whitaker was a kind, elderly woman, admitted for pneumonia. She was quiet and polite, and Marie enjoyed her company. But from the moment Mrs. Whitaker was moved to room 413, she began to change. She complained of feeling watched, of shadows moving in the corners of her room. At first, Marie thought it was just the effects of the medication, but Mrs. Whitaker's terror seemed real. One night, she told Marie, "He's here. He's standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. Please, don't leave me alone with him." Marie looked around the room but saw nothing. She tried to reassure Mrs. Whitaker, telling her it was just a bad dream, but Mrs. Whitaker shook her head. "No, it's real. He's always here, waiting." Marie promised to stay with her, hoping that her presence would ease the old woman's mind. As the hours passed, Marie began to feel a chill in the room, a cold that seemed to seep into her bones. She shivered, rubbing her arms, but the temperature continued to drop. Then, she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, a dark figure, standing at the foot of Mrs. Whitaker's bed. It was barely visible, more shadow than substance, but there was no mistaking the shape of a man. tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Marie froze, her heart pounding, but before she could move, the figure turned its gaze on her. Its eyes seemed to bore into her, filling her with an intense, suffocating fear. She tried to look away, but she couldn't move, trapped in its gaze. The figure took a step closer, its shadowy form gliding silently across the floor. Just then, Mrs. Whitaker began to scream, her voice filled with terror. Marie snapped out of her trance and rushed to her side, grabbing her hand and whispering words of comfort. The figure faded, dissolving into the shadows, but the cold remained, a lingering reminder of its presence. Marie stayed with Mrs. Whitaker for the rest of the night, too afraid to leave her alone. Mrs. Whitaker passed away 2 days later, but her final words haunted Marie. "He's coming for me. He won't let me rest." Marie tried to put the experience behind her, but room 413 continued to be a place of dread. Other patients reported seeing the shadowy figure, and more than one claimed they felt it watching them, waiting. Now, whenever she has to enter room 413, Marie feels the chill in the air and wonders if the figure is still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim.